introduction, because you all know Charles Duelfer. So I'll just emphasize he has also a very long resume, so I'll just emphasize a few things. And then we'll start the talk. During the talk, feel free, if you have any questions during the talk, feel free to raise your hand and ask your questions. We view this as an interactive discussion rather than just a seminar. All right, so Charles Duelfer, as you know, was the special advisor to the director of Central Intelligence to Iraq WMD. He was the lead author and he led the team that investigated WMDs in Iraq. The team produced a long and detailed report about WMD production development in Iraq called known as the Duelfer report. So you've all read this, at least for my classes. Before that, Charles was the Deputy Executive Chairman and later the Chairman of the UNSCOM, the UN Special Commission on Iraq, from 1993 to 2000, when it was terminated. And today he's the Chairman of the Board of a consulting firm dealing with intelligence, defense, and national security. And as you know, he wrote numerous articles and security and intelligence books. And one book, in particular, Hide and Seek, that you've all read, I'm sure, that deals with the search of WMDs in Iraq. So today, Charles has accepted to come and discuss the issue of WMD destruction, and particularly chemical weapons destruction in a hostile environment. And he will compare and contrast the case of Iraq and today's Syria, and tell us what are his views about the future of WMD destruction in Syria. Charles?
Thank you very much. Basically, I've been a bureaucrat for a long time, and one thing you learn as a bureaucrat is to diffuse responsibility. So I've got sort of a line of march in some slides which I thought I'd go through. But basically, I'm willing to take partial responsibility for what happens in the next however long we have together, and I'm going to put some of it on you. So ask questions about anything. I'm pretty good. I know this isn't a class, but we're at a university, so I'm thinking in terms of teaching points. I can put a teaching point on almost anything. So if you want to know about Saddam Hussein's girlfriends, or this, how did this, whatever, just feel free to ask. As a little bit of a teaser, one of the key things that affected the Iraqi decision-making with respect to WMD was Monica Lewinsky. But I'm going to kind of save that for a little bit further on. The goal there being to keep your attention. I know that I've got to compete with food. I should really emphasize, I'm not going to be, my feelings won't be hurt. In fact, I'll question your judgment if you just sit there and ignore the food over there. Plus, I'll feel guilty because I, probably haven't eaten. So anyway, I'm going to proceed through some charts and talk for a while and try to provoke comments or questions from you guys. As mentioned, the bulk of my experience has to do with Iraq. Obviously, Syria is more of a relevant question these days. I've had some indirect involvement in that. We watch it very closely. Likewise, Iran and some of those other countries. They're all individual cases, but they all inform one another, and I think they also learn from one another. So I'm going to start with Iraq, because chronologically that kind of preceded what we're seeing now in Syria. But you can draw your own conclusions. One of the first points, people talk about WMD, and what good is it? Is this stuff useful? And when you think about each of these countries which have produced and some of whom have used WMD, you know, some of them have gotten a lot of good out of it. In the case of Iraq, on 2 occasions, certainly from the perspective of Saddam, it saved him. In the 1980s, Iran and Iraq were at war. There were some decisions which Saddam made early on to initiate the war, but you know, and some of Saddam's calculations kind of made sense. But what he didn't figure out well was that there's a lot more Iranians than there were Iraqis, and the Iranians developed a technique we subsequently called human wave attacks, where, in the words of Tariq Aziz, Saddam Hussein's deputy prime minister, he said, well, you know, we, the Iraqis, were not the first to introduce unconventional weapons in that conflict. The Iranians did. I said, how was that? And he said, well, you know, the Iranian mullahs would get up in front of thousands of young men, speaking to them, getting them all worked up to a feverish pitch, saying that if they martyred themselves, they would have 40 virgins. And he went on like this, saying that the Iranians, by generating these human wave attacks, were introducing unconventional weapons. The thing about the human wave attacks is they worked. And the Iraqis were on the defensive. And they worked, that is, so long as you don't mind taking a lot of casualties. For Saddam, what was a good response for them? Well, chemical munitions. He used, as we, and when I say we in this case, I mean the UN Special Commission, UNSCOM, sounds like something you clean the toilet with now, but it stood for UN Special Commission on Iraq. It was our job to analyze, verify, work out what Iraq had. Well, we subsequently learned that Iraq used 101,000 chemical munitions in the war against Iran. And they worked. So when looking at what good is it, well, in the Iraqi experience, at least with respect to chemical munitions, there was a military utility to them. They firmly believed that their use of chemical munitions saved them in that war. I had Iraq, you know, save Saddam twice. What was the second case? Third? Well, the Iran-Iraq war saved Saddam against Iran. Next war in Kuwait, the Iraqis were convinced that WMD saved them in that case as well. How was that? Well, you may recall that before that conflict actually began, there was a last-ditch negotiation, political negotiation between Secretary of State Jim Baker and, again, this guy Tariq Aziz, who was kind of the westward face of Saddam. They met in Geneva. The Iraqis had previously been trying to explore American reactions before they invaded Kuwait. There was a meeting with the American ambassador, a woman named April Glaspie. And during that meeting, the message was transmitted that, and the Iraqi and the U.S. record of that meeting are very similar. The written records are very similar. The message was, this is a dispute among Arab countries which should be solved peacefully among Arab countries. That was before the invasion of Kuwait. We asked Saddam, because we asked him afterwards, well, do you remember anything about that meeting? And he says, well, not much, except I remember being relieved that the Americans weren't going to get involved. So that was the message which Saddam heard. What was said was one thing, but what was heard is another thing. That's always the case. But in this case, we would subsequently ask Saddam, what did we hear? Well, between that point in time, when he decided to invade Kuwait, thinking that the United States wasn't going to do much, the United States learned a little bit about communicating with Iraq. And Jim Baker, when he met with Tariq Aziz at this last-ditch meeting before the conflict actually began between the coalition in Iraq to expel Iraq from Kuwait, he handed over a letter which was unambiguous, in which Tariq Aziz, when he read it, said, this is impolite. I'm not going to pass this on to my esteemed leader, Saddam Hussein, whose delicate ears would not react well to this. But it said, basically, if our dispute is not resolved peacefully and it comes to military conflict, if your side elects to use unconventional methods, we will turn you into a gamma ray. I mean, it was pretty forward-leaning on not just making the rubble bounce in Baghdad, but use of nuclear weapons. That was a message which the Iraqis understood. And at one point I was discussing as UNSCOM in the 1990s, after the war, years after the war, what was your concept of use for the weapons of mass destruction which you had at the time? And they said that in response to this meeting, they elected not to use them except under certain circumstances because Saddam got the message. But, they said, by the way, you guys, looking at me as an American, in the 1990s, the United States didn't have relations, there was no embassy. I went in and out because I had a UN hat on. Nevertheless, the Iraqis saw me as the one American they could talk to. They said, you guys didn't go to Baghdad. And I said, well, no, that wasn't part of the deal. The deal was, the UN agreed, expel from Kuwait. You go, yeah. I'd say that too if I were in your shoes. We know why you didn't go to Baghdad. I go, yeah. Why? I said, because our great leader, Saddam Hussein, ordered the loading of chemical and biological agent into Scud warheads, aerial bombs, in both artillery and artillery rockets and shells. He ordered them to be dispersed, and he pre-delegated the authority to use them under the circumstances that the coalition forces went on to Baghdad. There's a long way of saying that from the Iraqi perspective, they were convinced that their possession and the readiness to use WMD in 1991 protected Saddam in that war. It deterred George Bush the Elder from going to Baghdad in 1991. So, in the question of what good is WMD, from Iraq's perspective, save the regime. I'm setting aside other cases where, potential proliferants or people who have or elect to keep WMD, they can see positive benefit. The Syrian case, which is the other one I was going to talk about, is simply, they developed this apace with Israeli nuclear program. That was their response. Starting in the 70s, throughout the 80s, 90s, you look at the public record on this, now public, they developed this and deployed it in large numbers as a way of offsetting the Israeli programs. From the Syrian perspective, they might conclude that it worked. I don't know. Certainly they could make that argument. Other countries in the region have made presumably similar decisions. The fact that Syria has now acceded to the Chemical Weapons Convention makes Egypt look odd. I mean, they're one of the few countries now which has not. And the suspicions about their holdings of chemical weapons is also pretty clear. But with respect to Syria, the possession of WMD in general, and in particular chemical munitions, they may think that it helped deter Israel. It gave them more status in the region. However, the utility of chemical munitions, I think they concluded obviously recently, is that it had lost its utility. Go on, I'm getting ahead of myself. I've kind of covered this point, except for one aspect of this. During the Iran-Iraq War, when they used 101,000 munitions, Saddam did, the point underneath that bull is no one really seemed to care. During the 1980s, the position of the United States was we tilted towards Iraq. in its conflict with Iran. There was a decision made that the United States could not afford to have Iraq lose. Now, if you're Saddam Hussein, and we spoke to him about this afterwards, how he looked at the world and the universe, that kind of made sense. He looked at the region and said, well, my country, Iraq, is westward-leaning, secular, got a lot of resources, fourth largest army on the planet, and we're the bulwark of defense against these crazy Islamists in Iran, who had humiliated the United States when their revolution took place in 1979. They took over the American embassy, they took hostages, they released them only on the day Ronald Reagan was inaugurated. I mean, they humiliated the United States. So from Saddam's perspective, it was quite logical that the United States would find its interest congruent with his. And throughout the 8-year war, during which hundreds of thousands of people were killed, the United States, while not providing weapons to Iraq, did provide agricultural credits and intelligence on Iranian troop concentrations. Now, if you're Saddam Hussein, worried about human wave attacks, and the United States is providing you information such as 15 clicks back in the third court, there's a massing number of Iranians, what would you do with that information? This is where you're supposed to say something. What would any normal person do with this information, given the Iraqi inventory of stuff?
Start worrying.
Sorry?
Start to worry, don't you?
Well, what would you do with the data?
Use it.
Use it, okay, yeah, because I don't want to say it. What would you do with that data? You've got an inventory of, airplanes and, people and stuff and yes, well, you use to target chemical munitions, which you did. So with that experience, though, your mindsets and biases which are accumulating over time, is Saddam getting a message, wow, this is really bad to use this stuff and the world's really going to be annoyed? That's not the lesson he was drawing from the decade of the 80s. We didn't have a chemical weapons convention at that time. It was under negotiation, and George Shultz, who was Secretary of State in the middle of the 80s, he would occasionally make a statement that chemical weapons are bad. But if you're Saddam Hussein, yeah, those are words, but what's happening on the ground? Different message. In any case, that's, the messages of the 80s were, not negative with respect at least to chemical munitions. Other aspects of WMD, nuclear and biology. Biology is, that was kind of addressed, at least at a political level, when the convention was done. Nuclear, NPT, always been kind of bad, but other people, countries have been, working away at it in various cases. But chemical munitions have a military utility in some circumstances. I'm not going to dwell on that, the 25th of July. Although, it's one of those, that date, when I wrote up there, July 20th, that was the day Saddam asked the American ambassador to come in to talk about the tensions with Kuwait. And on that day, history could have gone a lot of different directions. Just because it might amuse you, it doesn't have anything specifically to do with WMD. But to this day, I cannot convince Iraqis, whom I know very well from the Saddam regime, I can't convince them that we didn't want them to go into Kuwait. Why, you might ask?
Yeah.
And Saddam asked us, well, he never could figure out, he said, you must have wanted me to go in. Because looking backwards from their perspective, it's kind of a natural question. Well, if you didn't want me to go into Kuwait, why didn't you tell me dude, if you're thinking of going into Kuwait, we're going to deploy 500,000 troops, 6 carrier battle groups, 1,400 combat aircraft. We're going to assemble a coalition of 32 countries, and we're going to blast the living daylights out of you. We didn't say that. We said it's a dispute among Arab countries that should be solved peacefully among Arab countries. Saddam said, he said, look, I'm not stupid, I'm not crazy. I wouldn't, if you had told me that, I wouldn't have gone in. Why didn't we say that? Well, the reason is because we didn't know that we would do that either. If you had asked Jim Baker, what do you reckon the United States will do if Saddam gets it in his head to solve his economic problems by taking this little place that thinks it's a country and just kind of re-gluing it onto Iraq? We wouldn't have predicted that. So, I often try to imagine if I was Saddam Hussein's American analyst, intelligence analyst for America, and he asked me, hey, what do you reckon the Americans would do if we, glue Kuwait back onto Iraq where it belongs, predicting, future performance based on the past, which is what intelligence analysts are condemned to do, he would not have been predicting that the United States would organize this huge coalition, because the framework, the groundwork had changed. What had changed? The U.S.-Soviet dynamic. The Berlin Wall came down. All of a sudden we had all this military stuff that wasn't under lock and key in NATO. And we could, in the case of the Gulf, stand on principle. Saddam got kind of caught. We didn't. That's my explanation in answer to Saddam's question. Well, you didn't want me to go into Kuwait. Why didn't you tell me you were going to blast us to smithereens? Anyway, that's a little bit off topic, but that's one of those days, July 25th, where if the message had been somewhat different, if we'd been more prescient, if we'd been tougher, or more clear, tougher has a qualitative to it, but if we knew what we were doing, what would have been a lot different? Yes, ma'am.
So are you just saying that the proximity in time between the breakup of the Soviet Union and when this occurred, that we had not reassessed our national interest and so
We had,
the
exactly.
State
We had not
Department was just
recalibrated.
muddling around?
I mean, if we'd been sitting in this room in 1990, 1989, the bulk of what people would be thinking about would be U.S.-Soviet. The whole defense budget was cooked up based on the Soviet threat. So if you were in the intelligence business or State Department, you'd be worried about the NATO and Warsaw Pact stuff. Well, the other stuff, the term, he said it's out of area. It's really exciting. Oh, where are you working? Out of area. Oh, God. It wasn't the real stuff. Well, when the Berlin Wall came down, I mean, George Bush the elder, I think, is vastly underrated for what he managed to do. I mean, you think about the Eastern Europe and the reunification of Germany. There's a whole bunch of things which we don't think about, but were huge things which could have gone very badly wrong. Well, Saddam gets it in his brain to go invade Kuwait because he's under economic pressure and stuff, and these other, the other Gulf states, are keeping the price of oil down, and he's feeling, aggression because in his brain, this economic stuff is kind of the equivalent of aggression. I'm not excusing Saddam. I'm just saying, from his perspective, it's not like our perspective, but economic actions against him were real aggression. So he said, well, I'll just go over here. It's like, here, hold my beer. What could possibly go wrong? It would have been very difficult to anticipate what the United States would do. And I underline a point that I don't think if you'd asked Jim Baker on July 25th what the United States would do if Iraq went into, he wouldn't have been able to answer that question either. Or those talking points, which are given to it, would have been a lot stronger. So, I don't know if I answered your question, I talked for a while, but I deeply and I'm very grateful that you said something, because no one else
I'm going to go get something to eat.
you guys don't
Well,
Anyway.
Charles, isn't it true also from an intelligence failure standpoint that
the U.S. didn't think he was going to invade Kuwait until really the last 24 hours.
Well, you're right to raise that point, because, you know, I'm obviously leaving out a lot, but there was very ambiguous data. I mean, there was imagery, and there was debate inside, well, you know, he's moved, you know, Republican Guard divisions down, and what does that mean? Is he just trying to, you know, beef up his, you know, his position with, in arguing with the Kuwaitis over, you know, their slant drilling and stuff. But there was a lot of ambiguity. And when there's ambiguity, you know, the first response of, you know, political leaders is not say, well, let's take a tough position. It's kind of, yeah. So, I mean, you're exactly right. I mean, you know, if we knew unequivocally that Saddam was going to go in, I mean, I think the answer would have been a lot stronger. It wouldn't have been such a huge recalibration of our thinking. You know, by the same token, you know, when you look at Saddam's participation in that meeting on the 25th, you know, their default assumption, and they can be, you know, it can be Korea, it can be Syria, they think we're smart. You know, they think we spend $80 gazillion on intelligence. They think we know stuff. And this plays out regularly. But, you know, when Saddam's, you know, America analysts are saying, well, you know, what do you think the American, their default assumption is, well, you know, you got to understand Washington is a bunch of bureaucrats, and they don't really know what's going on. That's not what they assume. They assume that we know what's going on. So when Saddam hears this presentation by the American ambassador, he's thinking, well, you know, they must know we're teed up and ready to go. And, you know, knowing that, I get this, well, you know, it's a delicate position and you want to solve this peacefully among Arab countries. You know, he hears something different. I mean, but there's no solution to that problem. But I would encounter this regularly. I mean, when there's a leak in the press, for example, you know, the Russians, particularly the Iraqis, they always think, oh, well, why did this have, there must be a reason for this. They ask me, well, why did that happen? I don't know. Who knows? Could be anything. They don't like that answer. They think the last superpower should be much more organized and things should happen for a reason. You never convince them that it doesn't. Way off topic. But anyway, I'm dwelling on the Iraq thing, and I will return to Syria, but it's important if you look at the Iraq disarmament, you know, history. After the Kuwait War, there was a UN resolution 687, which was the mechanism for ceasing hostilities. And I got in trouble, not trouble, but I provoked a very strong response from the Iraqis one time, and I was meeting with Tarek Aziz and his other characters when I was doing the arms inspection stuff. And we had a whole list of things we wanted to do. We were going to inspect this, we were going to do this, we were going to do that went to the sensors, and here we wanted immediate access, blah, blah, blah. And Tarek Aziz, who, you know, in between cohibas, he smoked these things endlessly. He had a little guy come out and, you know, and light them and all that. But he said, wait a second, what gives you the right to do all this? And I said, well, look, you guys, you know, you invaded Kuwait, you lost the war, and then, you know, the UN. He said, wait a second. Back up that, what did you say we did in the war? I said, we had lost the war, so we didn't lose the war. And there was two things there. One is he was technically correct, because this UN resolution was a ceasefire resolution. And the dynamic was that so long as Iraq complied, they would cease fire. But the second thing is, in Saddam's brain, you know, the metrics were different. The pluses and minuses were quite different. And I could go on for hours about this, but let me just say that, you know, we tend to think and apply our sense of positives and negatives, winners and losers, you know, kind of based on what we've grown up with. Saddam, and I dare say, it doesn't work that way. You know, from Saddam's perspective, well, I'll make another clear statement. I'll ask the question, do clocks in Baghdad work the same way as they do in Washington? And by that I mean, is the sense of time the same? Well, but Saddam tended to think of his reputation centuries from now. For us in Washington, if something's 2 years out, you know, it's beyond our event horizon. We've got, you know, business cycles, election cycles, news cycles, you discount the future very heavily. Not for Saddam, and I dare say not for some of these other leaders. They think in terms of cause and consequence over a much longer time frame. So with the other aspect of, they didn't lose. No, it was a tactical retreat. In many ways, Saddam thought he won. I mean, here he is. He stood up to the last superpower, and he's still there. In his construct, that's a plus. So anyway, the dynamic which was set up for the disarmament of Iraq by the Security Council after the expulsion of Iraq from Kuwait was, you guys are going to be under sanctions until and unless this new outfit we've created, UNSCOM, verifies that you've disarmed and you've accepted a monitoring system which will assure the Security Council that you haven't restarted these programs. Until then, the sanctions stay on. Did you have your hand up? I'm sorry.
Yeah,
Yes.
just for clarification, so did Iraq use chemical weapons or biological weapons against Kuwait when it invaded, or did it just invade Kuwait?
They just invaded.
Okay,
The
so
conventional forces, their view was that when the coalition went in to expel them from Kuwait, though, that it deterred, specifically the United States, from going further in deposing Saddam, from going to Baghdad and getting rid of Saddam. So he felt that his possession and his pre-delegated authority to use, persuaded George Bush the Elder not to go to Baghdad. That was in their brain.
So Resolution 687 basically said to stop doing that, right? And then UNSCOM, was that created by Resolution 699? Did that come?
687, it was created.
687 was created, that, okay.
Correct. It said, the sanctions are basically going to stay on until you disarm, and to determine that you've disarmed, we've created this special group, the UN Special Commission on Iraq, which was not a part of any other treaty. It's a bunch of, it was a new organization. There was a role spelled out for IAEA on some of the nuclear stuff, and then disappearing into real complicated. But this was something which hadn't been done before. It was not part of a treaty. It was, it was coercive disarmament. If you're looking for an analogy, the analogy would be the Versailles Treaty after World War I, where Germany was subjected to disarmament provisions. And if you read, I'm kind of a junkie on this stuff. I've read a lot of the old reporting of, that commission. It is very similar. They had the same problems, hiding stuff and this and that. One side was a unitary actor, Germany, or in this case, Saddam, against a coalition. And the coalition tends to, fragment over time. But in any case, that was the dynamic. It was coercive. It was not a treaty. It was not like the NPT or the CWC, where people sign up for this and they accept inspectors because they believe it's in their national interest. The U.S. and the Russians have, nuclear weapons treaties because we both think, for whatever reason, it's better to have less than more, and so long as we can verify that the other guy's not going to get an advantage that we haven't detected or something. So that's an arms treaty versus, in this case, it was coercive disarmament. But what happened, and I say this because it informs other people's decision making, to include Bashar al-Assad. Saddam, in the spring, in April of 1991, when this resolution was just passed, he gets his guys around him and women, because under Saddam, women did all right. They had an RCC meeting, like a cabinet meeting. And his guidance was, well, look, I don't know what all these UN guys are going to do. How fastidious can they be? They're not very fastidious about other stuff that they do. And it said, well, look, my priority is to get out of sanctions. Everything else do on a non-interference basis with that. So, give them the obvious stuff. Don't bother them with stuff that nobody knows about. And that was his guidance. So they coughed up ballistic missiles, the Scud missiles, which they've been firing back and forth with Iran for years. Everybody knew they had them. And they gave up chemical munitions, most of them. But they said nothing. They remained absolutely silent on biological weapons. In fact, they denied that they had biological weapons, and initially denied that they had any kind of nuclear activity. So we as weapons inspectors, I mean, we were kind of chasing the obvious stuff, and then when we had other data which led us to believe that they had more on nuclear and more on biology, we pursued that, but that took years. So what accumulated was a track record where Iraq, well, first instance, they had a reason to have WMD because from their perspective, it saved them on 2 occasions, saved Saddam. And there's also this growing track record that they were lying to the weapons inspectors. So, you know, by the mid-1990s, late 1990s, you know, our assumptions were basically, these guys are never going to tell the truth. And, you know, Saddam would be crazy to give up WMD. So that was our one hypothesis, which, you know, in the intelligence business, if you've only got one hypothesis, that's bad. Because, you know, you only see things. It's like having, you know, I shouldn't say this. You know, if you're going to fall in love with something, don't fall in love with a hypothesis. You need at least 2 so that you can compare and contrast. You know, I'm not giving life advice here, but you know, we really made a huge mistake, a massive mistake on Iraq WMD because we had, in essence, one hypothesis. So we only looked for data and only saw data as it related to that hypothesis. Big tradecraft error. What is, you know, how does that affect other countries in the region and Syria when they look at that? I mean, it's another, you know, that's a whole other question. Or I'm just gonna show some pictures just of the stuff we did because, you know, in terms of inspection, it was pretty intrusive. We had, in essence, the Security Council said you basically do whatever you want inside Iraq to accomplish your task of verifying the disposition of Iraq WMD. We could talk to whoever we wanted, we could gather documents, we could put in sensors, we could, you know, take stuff in, take stuff out, we could fly around. You know, we had video, we were trying to have surprise inspection, although I deeply suspect we never had a fully successful surprise inspection because the Iraqis, we were their most important target. You know, they collected on us in New York, in Bahrain, we had a forward operating base that collected us all over the place when we were inside Iraq. So they were always able to provide warning time to any facility that they were worried about. But then we had YouTube. We didn't have predators in those days, but to effect some loitering coverage, we would the United States would fly for us occasionally a U-2 and then stick a little UN thing on the back. We had a lot of stuff. The United States lent us some helicopters. This is a very old form of ground penetrating radar on a Huey that we had flying around. So we're looking for, you know, hidden stuff underground. You know, again, we had CH-53s which we used to move our people around, where we could fly over facilities, take all the imagery we wanted. I mean, within weeks, UNSCOM knew far more about Iraq than anybody else on the planet. I mean, you know, for maybe the first 10 days, you know, UNSCOM would receive intelligence data from other countries, largely the United States, because they just invaded, you know, conduct this war. But within literally days, we knew much more about Iraq than anybody else, because we were on the ground. We go all over the place. We could talk to people. What else? They really did have chemical weapons. I mean, this is a CW warhead for the Al Hussein, which is the Iraqi modification of the Scud missile. They had 75 of those. 50 of them were loaded with chemical munitions, 25 with biological munitions. It was only in 1995 that they acknowledged this, but they had a biologic weapons production facility called Al-Hakam. It produced anthrax, botulinum toxin, and some stuff called aflatoxin, which, you know, people here may know more than I do. But, you know, I can work out, and it makes sense, at least to my brain, anthrax and aflatoxin, and botulinum toxin. Aflatoxin causes liver cancer, which, you know, I might prevent a lieutenant from becoming a colonel. But I was never able to get the Iraqis to state what the purpose was of this. You know, there's some people who, I mean, the one obvious hypothesis is that they were trying to modify populations without there being a signature on that. There's another hypothesis, which is that They think that aflatoxin can be an immune system suppressant. So like the tactics where if you're going to use chemical munitions, you might go in first with some HE bombs to break all the windows. And then you send in your chemical rounds so that this stuff disperses better. There might be a similar strategy in the biological approach area where you would disperse something which is going to suppress the immunization system. I don't know. I mean, I have no idea if that's what they were really doing, but it was something that a Westerner was suggesting. We really don't know, even to this day, why they were doing this work on aflatoxin, but they did put it in weapons. This is some aerial bombs that they loaded with both BW and chemical munitions. It's something called R4, or just gravity bombs. This is a funny picture. They're 155 millimeter mustard rounds. And the mustard they made was really good. It stayed like 92% pure for decades. Well, if you were all, budding intelligence analysts, I would put the next point this way. I would say, well, if if the president came into your cubicle and said, give me an order of battle of Iraq, or I know there's WMD in Iraq someplace, find it. What would you do? There's 440,000 square kilometers of Iraq, and as an analyst, well, that's a lot of pictures to look at. Where do you start looking? Well, you make assumptions. And some of those assumptions might be, well, I might put near a road, might power lines, perimeter security, maybe even a bunker, who knows? That's what you look for. Well, the Iraqis, worked out how we thought much better than the other way around. And there was a guy, a senior Iraqi, who asked me one day, he was, why you Americans, why do you always blow up buildings? I don't know. It's in our genes. That's what we do. We blow up buildings. But I thought about it. I said, God, why do we always blow up buildings? And all of a sudden it dawned on me, that's the way we organize data. We get these imagery things, and everybody's got pictures, and they've got arrows they stick, and there's a roof, and it says, missile plant, or mosque, or, I don't know what. But that's the way that's our cognitive structure way is buildings. Well, Saddam, and we have a recording of this, he was talking to his RCC, it's this big table with bobbleheads around it, and Saddam at one end, and he goes, ladies and gentlemen, I've been thinking about our country, and I'd just like to offer some thoughts. We are under sanctions, and it's very difficult for us to replace valuable things. And so I've just suggested, if you have anything which is very important to our great country, and very valuable, what do you suppose he said? Yeah, but don't put it in the building. The Americans blow up buildings. Hence, these are just mustard rounds in the middle of nowhere. There's nothing there. It's 3 dopey UN inspectors with floppy hats. The Iraqis said, okay, you're out of chemical stuff. Well, here's some here. There? Well, there? It's like if we put our nuclear weapon, just went out and threw that. We're out to on Prince George's park or something. Put it under a tree someplace. No one will ever find it. It would probably work, but that's not the way we would do it. Anyway. Different mindset. They really did have ballistic missile Scud launches. That's a launch out of the Rocky Western Desert. God, anybody know what that is?
Real
Can't even see it. Not a real gun, although that's a good guess. It's something which, there's a question which I sometimes ask incoming analysts. Whoa, everyone will fall asleep. No, I asked you, can you see something that you don't have a word for? This is, to get into the notion of cognition. Well, if Dick Cheney came to you and said, give me an order of battle of Iraq WMD, well, he said, oh God, now what am I going to do? You might, theoretically take a piece of paper and you draw rows and columns, and the columns would be I don't know, ships, helicopters, artillery pieces, something. And then you try to fill in the number, you start looking at this. So, this, if you saw a picture of that, imagery, I'd say, it's not something that would jump out at me. It's something I have to put on my chart for an ordered Battle of Iraq. This is something which we came to term a super gun. There was a guy, a Canadian, who was really into artillery and stuff, and the Iraqis had gotten onto him, and they hired him to make a big artillery piece. And this is a 350 millimeter diameter artillery tube, which they constructed, glued onto the side of a mountain. Now, I don't know if anybody here has been an artillery officer, and to schlep around a mortar base plate or something. But, when we do stuff, I mean, you kind of, you figure, you adjust your firing out, elevation, azimuth, then you adjust the charge. Well, this thing, you could hit one spot, albeit very far away, but it didn't make sense to us. It didn't make no sense whatsoever. I mean, are there any does anybody here have a potato cannon? So you do understand. Okay. So I mean, if you're gonna hit them, you got to adjust elevation, azimuth, and then whatever charge you use. What do you use in your potato cannon?
Hairspray.
I prefer unscented. But you guys, you shouldn't have potato cannon. You're setting a bad example. But in any case, I mean, but this made no sense to us from the way we think. So anyway, they did. They built that. So far as I know, they're the only country
This
that's...
direction was pointed.
Well, that's a good question. For this one, it was internal to Iraq. It was entire, but they had ordered 1,000 millimeter tubes, which they were going to, and I'm not sure, but it was going to be in the direction of Saudi Arabia. It wasn't Israel, at least at the level, at the stage where we detected this and caused them to have to describe it. I mean, it was just weird, I mean, I've really emphasized this point out, we make assumptions about how they think and what's important to them, and we calibrate and we do all our negotiations on that, and it goes on with Iran now and North Korea. We really don't understand what the pluses and minuses are for them. It's not, we have to make assumptions because we have to do something. And you have to try to change behavior. But to do that, there's a lot of room for big mistakes and big miscalculations on all sides. Oh God, this is just some pictures, YouTube pictures where, we would be blocked, we the weapons inspectors, and while we're blocked, we would find the Iraqis had mustered up a bunch of trucks and gone out the back door. And at that point in time, because we only had one hypothesis, is that they must be hiding WMD, we really weren't thinking along the lines of, well, there might be a lot of other things that Saddam would want to hide from weapons inspectors. And it turned out there were a lot of other things besides WMD they wanted to hide. Other things which didn't reflect well on the regime, like human testing, or what their agents were in different parts of the world, what they were doing. We always tended to link it to WMD. This, as promised, can you see that? There was, in 1998, it was kind of when Iraq decided that cooperation with the UN wasn't getting them anywhere. And they made decisions to basically ratchet down their cooperation with the weapons inspectors. Well, underlying a lot of that decision-making in Baghdad was what was going on in Washington. And I'll just briefly say that, when this, that's Monica Lewinsky. Did people remember Monica Lewinsky? Maybe I'm too old. She was this chick at the White House, and but there was a scandal, and it caused distractions. Well, when it broke, I happened to be in Baghdad talking with this fellow Tariq Aziz, and he goes, Mr. Duelfer, we got to this chemical weapons stuff, but I ask you one question? Yeah, what? He goes, well, you and I have known each other a long time, and I just have one question. what is an intern? And that's what I thought, well, it's like, these guys have no clue. I mean, because from their perspective, here's the last superpower, we send things to the moon and all this stuff, and yet, the president of the most powerful country on the planet is hobbled because of, an intern. They didn't understand that. It made, I mean, if you were Saddam's American analyst, how would you explain that to Saddam? I mean, you'd say, oh, she must be from a very important tribe. It didn't add up. And yet, I mean, he had an exquisite sense of reward and punishment and could smell weakness. And that sense of weakness, underlay a lot of his decision-making throughout 1998, which was a critical year, which ultimately he decided he wasn't getting anywhere on disarmament because the resolution was that if he disarms, the Security Council is supposed to lift the sanctions, right? Well, throughout the 90s, we're accumulating a mindset and a bias that these guys are never going to tell the truth. Well, 1998, he's listening to the United States, and Bill Clinton and Madeleine Albright was saying, they must comply, we're going to have regime change, although they didn't do anything about it. But there was all this stuff that sanctions are going to stay on because Iraq doesn't comply. Well, what's one thing that Saddam knew that we didn't know? He knew that he pretty much coughed everything up. Now, Saddam's assumptions about us are that we're smart. He's not, his American analyst isn't saying, well, yeah, they say all this stuff. They really probably don't know what's going on. That's not the hypothesis that was dominant in Baghdad. So when they would hear these statements from the United States, they assumed that we know that they've given everything up, and we're just going to make stuff up to keep the sanctions on. And to combine that with other events, that they decided to ratchet down cooperation. By the end of 1998, we, the weapons inspector, said we can't do the job under the conditions they permitted us to operate. What happened? Bill Clinton, President Clinton, ordered a 4-day bombing campaign where we, the United States, and supported by the UK, blew up a bunch of places which the Iraqis really didn't care about. And afterwards, the Iraqi ambassador said to me, if you'd known that was all you guys were going to do, we would have thrown you out a long time ago. That turned out to be a good decision for Iraq, because from that point on, the Security Council was divided. There was no consensus on what to do. The sanctions were crumbling, and Saddam was doing pretty well. What is the lesson for other countries in looking at that from 1998 forward? Well, the attention of the Security Council is not necessarily attention that can be sustained. Unanimity of the Security Council is not necessarily can be sustained. Now, Saddam paid a huge price under sanctions, so that was a very important tool. He wouldn't have cooperated as long as he did if it weren't for that presence of sanctions. But others looking at it, Syria and others, what conclusions are they going to come to? It's a mixed message. You can also look at, from Syria's perspective, say, well, when did they get rid of Saddam? Oh, after he got rid of WMD. When did they get rid of Gaddafi? Oh, after he gave up his chemical and nuclear programs. It's a mixed bag. In the spring of 1998, in May of 1998, India and Pakistan set off nukes. What happened to them? Well, Pakistan became our ally in the global war on terror. After decades, we were haranguing them. Oh, don't go nuclear, you can't do this, blah, blah, blah. Well, they scoot across the finish line, and oh, that's all right. There's really mixed messages. And I'm not sure, if I were Bashar al-Assad, I'm not sure what would dissuade me from, maintaining or expanding my weapons programs. Let's skip that. So what did Syria have? They had, they started their program in the 70s with chemical, at least. Biology, I don't know what they've got. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in the press that they have a biologic weapons program, but I can't tell you. I think it's well-founded speculation, but I don't know. The nuclear program seemed to end when the Israelis bombed Al Kabir, which was pretty interesting. It was in September 97, or excuse me, 07, if I remember correctly. That kind of left Bashar al-Assad with CW. That was his, it was still an important thing for him, I would argue, until the insurgency came out. And then all of a sudden his calculation changed. Now, when the war in Syria broke out, and it kind of evolved, what had value to Bashar al-Assad began to change very quickly. The recent history on this is on August 21st, there was a massive use of chemical munitions, which everyone in this town ascribes solely to the Damascus government. I suspect that's probably right, but I don't know that we know that 100%. I'd be prepared to be surprised that there aren't other things out there which make it a less clear picture than people like to present in this town. But nevertheless, certainly chemical munitions were used, and it was very ugly. And certainly there was very ugly video. So what happened? The president, who I can't begin to describe because I don't really understand all the pressures that he was under to do something with respect to Syria, gave a nationwide speech on September 10th, I think, saying that he's going to ask Congress for authorization to use a limited military strike to deter and degrade Syrian chemical munitions. And he said it in the speech because there's a terrible video about it. I mean, I don't mean to be critical of the White House, but this is an odd message to me. I mean, and particularly because if we did conduct a military strike, I think it's highly likely there could be very ugly videos the next day of the results of the strike, of people who were injured in the course of that strike. So if you're going to get into a contest of ugly videos, I don't know that, I'm not sure this was a smart thing to do. Nevertheless, that threat seemed to provoke a response, largely from the Russians. And the Russians, I would point out, that their foreign minister, a guy named Sergei Lavrov, the guy I know pretty well because he was the Russian ambassador at the UN for 5 years, during the height of all this stuff that I droned on about the Iraqi circumstances. He went through all that. So he knew the tools that were available. And within 24 hours of the president's speech, where he was seeking the authority to bomb Syria, he got Bashar al-Assad to start seeing the plus side of getting rid of chemical munitions. And I think that all those pluses that I went through that Saddam saw, all of a sudden they're not big pluses to Bashar al-Assad, because in an insurgency, the chemical weapons really aren't that useful. I mean, they can create terror, but there's a lot of blowback in it. It's not a war like the Iran-Iraq war. And I don't know this, but I deeply suspect that Lavrov went to Bashar al-Assad and said, hey, listen, your only hope of surviving this is to somehow gradually increase your international legitimacy while the rebels will decrease theirs. And the best way you can do that right now is get rid of this stuff which you can't use anyway. I'm making that up, but I suspect that kind of a conversation took place because very quickly Bashar al-Assad made the right noise, said, I will accede to the CWC and get rid of all this stuff according to a very tight time frame. Within days, Sergei Lavrov and John Kerry met in Geneva to work out a framework agreement which laid out a calendar for accomplishing all this. And astonishingly, within months, we went from a country that was one of the biggest holders of chemical munitions to they've gotten rid of their production facilities, their munitions, and their storage capacity. Now, what's lingering now is getting rid of the precursors, not the problem that we're that we see today. But the bulk of Bashar al-Assad's stuff is gone. I think getting rid of the chemicals, I'm going to end on this point, he's finally getting rid of these chemicals is getting mixed up now in the negotiations going on in Geneva with everything else. So he's somehow playing that as a political tool, but I deeply suspect that the Russians are going to come down on him very hard on that. We, the United States, like a lot of other people, every issue that we wanted the Russians to behave well on, we raised before the Olympics. So if you're Putin, you're going to have the Olympics, you want everything to be nice. Everybody who's got something, they can, the day before the Olympics, they're going to start asking them about, hey, what about this? Anyway, but I think Bashar al-Assad will get rid of his chemical munitions. That doesn't say much about the rest of the mess in Syria. I suppose at least one good thing came out of it. Let me stop there. I droned on longer than I expected. Questions?
I read somewhere that the UNSCOM going into Iraq, that was funded by the Iraqi government. So I guess my question is, the inspection team that's going into Syria, is that being funded by the Syrian government or UN and contributors?
It is very similar in the sense that the UN people, and when I said UN, I'm going to include the staff of the OPCW, which is the organization supporting the CWC, but they're meant to verify. They give to say, we want all this stuff, but the Syrians actually have to move the stuff. They say, okay, you've given us the documentation, here are all these, I don't know, whatever kind of munitions they have, we want to see them destroyed, and we'll tell you how we want to destroy it, maybe drive it over with a tractor. But so the Syrians have to perform a lot of the work themselves. For getting the chemicals to the port at Latakia, it's the Syrians who actually have to move the stuff. The short answer is yes, it's a similar rule where inspectors in Iraq verify, but ask the Iraqis to do the work, and it's a similar circumstance in Syria. Sir?
Charles, you made some excellent points about how we and our
You've lost all credibility already.
But misperceptions are really critical, and we see them all the time. Now, looking at Syria, we've seen use, certainly 21 August, and then smaller scale prior to that, it's been discussed, reported. So I think a real question is, if you look at it not so much from a U.S. perspective, but for example, let's just say non-state actors in the region or other state actors in the region, what lessons might they be learning from what has happened in Syria?
That's a great question. I mean, what does Iran take away from all of this? I don't know. I'm sure there's some poor slob in the American intelligence system who has to answer that question. But I don't know. I mean, the president has to think through that. He has to answer that. He has to think about that question and think, well, how does that affect the discussions with Iran? I don't know. Non-state actors, I mean, people ask the question, well, you focus on it, you say, oh, it's great that Syria gets rid of its chemical weapons, but what does that mean? The international community, would much prefer Syrians to slaughter themselves with just guns and bullets and stuff. They don't want Syrians to slaughter themselves with chemical munitions. Well, if you're a Syrian, you could kind of understand that. On the other hand, one of the real risks is, as is embedded in your questions, that this stuff will get into the hands, will leak out of the control of the central government and get into the hands of Hezbollah or whatever, and who knows what will happen there. And that is a real risk, and that's a real positive outcome of getting this stuff out of Syria. But, how that affects the calculations of other countries in the region, boy, there's a lot of pluses and minuses to this. I mentioned Egypt before. I think they're going to feel kind of lonely because there are very few countries which haven't signed up for the CWC. Egypt's one of them now, and they kind of stand out in the region. Now, Egypt, of course, in the scale of problems facing, whoever's running Cairo these days, this is probably not at the top of their list. but, you know, it makes them stand out.
So a follow-up based on your years of inspections and then also going back in with the ISG. In terms of what's going on in Syria, and the way you described, a lot of it involves the work being done by the Syrians, whether it's destruction in situ or movement to Latakia. What about the verification issue?
This is not a case like Iraq where, first of all, we didn't blow the place up first. You know, in Iraq, it was hard to get a baseline because we blew the place up first, and it was even hard even for the Iraqis to know what they had. You know, they put it out in the middle of fields, like in that picture. You know, so then we asked them for an exquisite, you know, orderly list and catalog of everything they had. That was hard for them to do. In the case of Syria, there clearly, I think, is a will to comply with this, and they've got, you know, Sergei Lavrov's thumbs on Bashar al-Assad's carotid artery, and you know he's squeezing, and it has its effect. I'm overstating this, obviously, but you know, I don't see, you know, the cost for Syria to be caught cheating at this point would be huge. I mean, it would be giving up all the plus that presumably they're getting in terms of, you know, somehow getting some kind of international legitimacy or prestige back. And the benefit of hanging on to some of this stuff, I don't see it. So I think, and the OPCW inspectors were pretty clear about how satisfied they are with the declarations made by Syria. It's been surprising a little bit to me that the reports, the internal reports of OPCW and the reports to their governing board, their executive committee, have not leaked. Apparently they haven't. But they've, you know, what the members have said is Syria's actually done pretty well. Up until this point where they're supposed to move their precursor chemicals and get them out of the country. So I don't know. I tend to be relatively optimistic that this small slice of the Syrian problem might work out. The rest of the thing will disappear into some smoldering crater, but at least we got rid of the chemical weapons. I shouldn't be that, I'm speaking glibly, and it's a horrible situation. I don't mean to make light of this, but you know, we focus on the problems we can solve. The rest of it is just horrible. Sir?
Prior to UNSCOM, was there any evidence of Iraq moving WMD across borders?
Oh, that's
I wonder if,
yeah.
if Syria, is there any possibility you think they could do that as well?
Oh, that's a twist on the question. I thought, what I was expecting to hear, you know, like Saddam, what I was expecting to hear was there were these reports that Iraq moved WMD out of Iraq before the invasion took place in 2002, 2003, and they moved it to Syria. And we tried to track that down, but that's kind of one little loose end that I wasn't able to fully nail when I was running the Iraq survey group. I'm 90% confident that they did not. Largely, well, because we couldn't find any substantiating. There were a few reports, but if that had happened, somebody would have known. Plus, Saddam Hussein's presidential secretary, the guy who knew as much about anything that was going on in Iraq, outside of Saddam, a guy named Abd Awood, who they hanged 2 years ago, somebody I knew pretty well and spoke a lot with after we invaded. You know, he had every incentive in the planet to say what they had done, and he also was in charge of all their Syria stuff. He said they had not moved WMD to Syria. But your question is better than that, because it says, well, did Syria then move it onward to someplace? I'm sure everybody's watching that pretty carefully. I don't see where the incentives would be for that to happen. The risk the largest risk is that it would go into non-state actor hands somehow. Hezbollah comes to mind. The other thing which, you know, I don't fully understand, but makes me think that some of this doesn't necessarily add up. When Aki Selstrom, who headed the UN team which investigated the allegations of use, the the use on August 21st and dates. When he gave his report, there were pictures of some of the munitions and stuff that were used. They were not really good munitions. They were they didn't look that good. There was the M14, which was a modification of a rocket with a modified warhead. It didn't look to me like something that somebody who'd been doing this stuff for 3 decades would have been doing. So I know I say this without drawing any conclusions or suggesting anything other than what it is. But when you look at those munitions, you wonder, is that strictly the stuff of a highly professional army which has been doing this stuff for a long time? It opened up to me the possibility, I don't know if it's a high probability, but that there are other people making this. Some of those munitions looked like the stuff that was coming into Iraq, and you may remember that there was these things called explosively formed projectiles, which were, they were hitting us pretty hard, and the notion was that insurgents were learning this expertise from across the border. So I don't know. I'm not really answering your question. I'm just kind of talking for a while, but it's a very good question. I'm not sure that by intent Syria would have provided it to non-state actors at the highest level. But there's a lot of people in the food chain who may have mixed loyalties or whatever. I don't know. It's a risk. Yes,
I have a related question, like technical question. How hard is generally to hide the chemical weapon? Like if you were in Iraq and you weren't provided the guidance like where to go and what to look for, is it still possible to hide it or you will find things?
Here's one of the big problems we had. The Iraqis sometimes didn't mark their munitions. And Iraq had a lot of munitions. I mean, a lot. And so you go into a bunker, and it's like thousands of 155 millimeter rounds. You can't test them all. I mean, you have to So, yes, you could hide a few rounds and hide a book in a library. But the structure to use in a militarily significant way is harder to hide. I mean, you have to be able to deploy it. So, and you have to be able to do it in large numbers. Chemical munitions, to be useful in the military, you need a lot of them. If you're going to use them for terrorism, that's another thing. And if it's not worth the effort in a way to make a chemical weapon for terrorism. There's other things you can do which cause a lot more mischief that are easier to do. So, I mean, it's a very good question. How easy is it to hide? And the question, I would then return to well, hide a lot or a little? And if you're going to just hide a little bit, what good is it? It's not that useful. Part of our inspections in Iraq, we were going after, we wanted to know the last detail. Simply because of the track record of Saddam. I mean, at the end of the day, would it have really mattered if he had 1,000, mustard rounds left over someplace? I mean, it would be a gross violation of the UN resolutions, yes. But would it have made a big difference in the military balance in the region? Yeah, not that much. I mean, and it's the case, as it turns out, they're still finding chemical munitions in Iraq because they're left over from the war. I mean, nobody knew where they were. They were fired, they didn't go off. Every once in a while, somebody, finds an old sarin round someplace. But does it mean anything? Saddam didn't know it was there. So what difference does it make? I don't know. Saying what difference it makes has a bad odor these days. There's a famous quote that, a former Secretary of State said. I'm steadfastly trying to say what difference. It makes a difference, but it's not a huge military effect.
I think if we stay
many more hours with you tonight, but
Well,
I don't think that's a possibility, right? So we'll take two more questions, and we'll end up here. So, Sida and somebody else who has a last question.
Speaking behind the camera, you said that, or it sounds like you've said that Iraq framed the utility of its WMD in terms of its deterrent capability, especially with regards to Iran, to some extent in its conflicts, having WMD was helpful. So given that, why do you think it held on to its secret bioweapons program for so long? Because obviously it being a secret just wasn't helpful at all.
I think I would base my answer on what Saddam told us. And he said a couple of things. One, in debriefing him, which is a very cooperative debriefing session that we had, and we had a very good guy who was doing this, made reference to a speech he gave in June of 2000, where he said, you cannot expect Iraq to give up a rifle and live only with a sword if its neighbors don't give up their rifles and live only with swords. This sounded, at least to our ears, like that sounds an awful lot like he's making a case for keeping WMD, because if Iraq got rid of its WMD, and I'm speaking a little bit glibly here, it might have been the only country in the region without some form of WMD. More particularly, as Iran points to Israel, and then in those days Syria, et cetera, et cetera. So we asked Saddam, what was that all about? And his answer was, look, you Americans, you're 6,000 miles away. I'm not really worried about you guys. I'm worried about Iran. I wanted to make them worry about what I have. So his answer was, he was worried about deterring not so much the United States, but his neighbor, with whom he had fought a long war. It's a traditional enemy. So that was one part of the answer. The other thing on biology, and I kind of alluded to this before, but he made a decision that it was his priority in 1991 to get out of sanctions. He didn't know what UNSCOM was going to be. UNSCOM didn't know what UNSCOM was going to be. The thing that sounds like you clean the toilets, there's a bunch of inspectors. Everyone's assumption in 1991 was that this wouldn't go on very long. The people who cooked this up in Washington thought that it wouldn't go on very long because they kind of assumed that Saddam was going to fall from power. There was an uprising of the Shia, and everyone was saying, we'll do this UN thing, but, Saddam's not going to be around. They weren't thinking, 3 or 4 years ahead. Saddam was thinking that, well, how serious is the UN about anything it ever does? And everybody's got an interest in Iraqi oil coming back on the market. So he figured, let's not confuse this with things that no one knows about. So, as I suggested, he said his instructions were, give them the obvious stuff, give them what everybody already knows, which was ballistic missiles, the Scud missiles, and the chemical munitions. And the guidance was to don't talk about biological weapons. This, of course, caused them a huge problem because for years they were trying to sustain this artifice, and the problem they had is one of continuity. Like you've got a camera there. If you're making a movie and you're doing different shots of an audience like this, there's somebody who's in charge of making sure everything's lined up the same way. He's going to remember, okay, well, these guys, we got 3 people in the front row and this and that, and there's a clock in the background that says quarter of. You can't then take a shot over here and all of a sudden it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Somebody has to sustain that continuity. Well, the Iraqis had that same problem in sustaining the story which they told to UNSCOM. We would ask things, well, okay, we said this kind of testing, which way was the wind blowing that day? So I don't know, because if you were doing a chemical weapons test, you would know which way the wind was blowing. And if one guy says it was blowing this way, then 2 weeks later, if you ask somebody else, they've got to have the same answer. That's a huge problem. And for years, they had to sustain this artifice that there was no BW. And eventually, they couldn't. If we had more time, I would tell you a story that I'm very proud of about how we caused them to have to acknowledge that, but we'll save that for another session.
Well, we have the time we have.
You want it?
Yeah, bring it.
You want to hear this?
Yeah.
This is something I call the progressive idiot story, or theory. We UNSCOM, we came into possession of a lot of information from countries which had exported things to Iraq. And we learned that Iraq had imported 42 tons of some stuff called growth media. For those who really do BW, you'll know more about this stuff than I do. But growth media, I will explain, is the stuff that you use to grow cultures. So if you know, unlike, I grow penicillin in the bottom of an empty beer bottle. If you're in a laboratory or a hospital or a university and you're culturing something, you get some stuff called, I don't know, peptone or tryptone. Or it's special stuff dialed in for certain types of, stuff that you want to grow. And for diagnostic purposes, for legitimate purposes, you buy this stuff by the pound. We learned unequivocally that Iraq had imported 42 tons of growth media. So this was a fact. And it didn't kind of fit in with the story Iraq was telling. So there was one night in particular, we would have these endless meetings with them. There would always be late at night in Baghdad, and there'd be a bunch of the UN people on one side and a bunch of Iraqis on the other side. There was a guy named, I think it was Ami Rashid, who was leading us. And so I said, well, General Rashid would come to talk about a few things tonight. One thing I really wanted to address, and it has to do with some information we have about things that you import. Well, okay. Tell me. I'm dressing this up, but I mean, this really happened. I go, well, we've learned that you imported 42 tons of growth media. What's all that about? And you go, and so they all go running out, smoke a whole bunch of cigarettes, and they all come back in. And the guy goes, oh, Mr. Duelfer, I'm so glad you asked that question. And, at our senior levels, Iraq has no equal on the planet. Great country, our great leader, picture's always on the wall. A great leader, the bar none, best country on the planet. But, down at the lower levels, we are just a third world country. And so when we procure something, and bear in mind, it's very difficult to get things while you wicked Americans are keeping sanctions on, someone fills out a voucher. And so an individual was given a voucher, and he gave it to a clerk and said, buy 1 kilogram of peptone. The clerk passes it to his supervisor. The supervisor looks at it and says, 1 kilogram's good, I'll make it 10, that's better. And he passes it to his supervisor. He said, well, 10 good, I'll make it 100. And we wound up with 42 tons. I said, I'm so glad you told me that. I won't tell you what I was thinking. But before we leave that topic, what happened to all the documents? They all go out and then they come back in again and they say, Mr. Duelfer, I'm so glad you asked that question. Well, those riots which you provoked after the war, with the uprising, and they went around and they burned stuff, and things fell off of trucks and stuff. We lost them all. Oh, General, I'm so glad you told me that. I'll tell you. And then, so the next line, well, what happened to the rest of the 42 tons of this growth media? They all go out after they come back in. And they say, well, those guys who stirred up the riots and stuff, they burned the growth media too. This was, it was ludicrous. I give them credit for sustaining a straight face when they're telling us this. But that problem that they had of continuity became impossible to sustain. And we kept, hammering them on this stuff. Finally, they tried to make a deal. They said, if you, the weapons inspectors, give us a clean bill of health in the chemical area, and tell the Security Council that you have accounted for all that stuff, we will satisfy you on the biology area. And they wanted to kind of negotiate a common understanding of reality. And, we were much more, I guess, categorical about that. We finally did kind of negotiate an approach where they then admitted in 1995 that in fact they did have an offensive biological weapons program and had produced 28,000, I forget the unit of measure now, of anthrax, a lot. And then we were supposed to say, okay, well, that's good, done. It wasn't that easy, but anyway, that was the progressive idiot theory that I came with. But I mean, I make light of it, but by the accident of birth, these guys, most of them were just technocrats. And they happened to be born in Iraq, and they had to face decisions in their careers which we never had faced. And when you're talking to these guys under circumstances where their lives are literally at risk, you can smell fear. They're sitting on the opposite side of a conference table trying to explain something which they know is not really right, but they've got the government minders around them looking at them. That's a horrible position that we were putting them in. But that's what we had to do as UN. There wasn't a question. Sorry.
I was just wondering about, like your personal safety. How do you feel about your safety there? I've read that many times inspectors were intimidated or prevented from kind of doing their job. So it's kind of
yeah, there was. I mean, compared with 2003, it was nothing. I mean, when I was running Iraq, we lost people. I mean, but that was a different set of circumstances. In the UNSCOM days, I mean, we were under surveillance all the time, and the Iraqis were doing everything possible to provide warning, because they viewed us not just as UN inspectors; they thought of us as a bunch of spies. The UN, everybody's spying on somebody up at the UN. I mean, that's just what they do. But they saw us as a risk to their national security, and there was no bigger risk than the weapons. So they would follow us. There was, intimidation. Yeah, they would have like riots. I mean, it was. They put pressure on the inspectors. And I guess that certainly contributed to the judgments of the inspectors. That if they were really coming clean on all this stuff, why would they do all that? But from Saddam's perspective, here are these guys coming in, and what gives them the right to say, oh, I want to go to Mukhabarat headquarters? You and what army? So I don't know. I mean, I could argue both sides. I think, in my memory, it's probably the least cooperative environment for a weapons inspector was Iraq. Because I think even in Syria is dangerous because you get caught. Some rounds will come by and you happen to be in the wrong place. But it wasn't the receiving country that's the risk. In Iraq, it was, I guess, really the country itself. The other hazards were, the place had been blown up, so there's all this industrial waste around. We ran a hydrolysis plant and an incinerator in a place called Muthanna State Establishment for 2 years straight, getting rid of Iraqi munitions. And when I say we, it was we supervising the Iraqis. And we'd have like all these like moon suit on. You got the scuba tank, you got one in the scuba tank and a mask, and you got this little cam thing, it's flashing death, death, death. And next to you is some Iraqi smoking a cigarette. It was a risky environment just because it was like a huge toxic waste dump. So I don't know. And I was very concerned about inspectors' health. I wanted to do longer-term records on people's health, but the UN elected not to do that. I think they had a lawyer that got involved in that. They didn't want to ask questions. They weren't sure they would like the answer. I don't know. I'm not sure that answered your question.
All right. Well, thank you very much for your presentation.